Welcome, dear listener. Allow yourself to settle in. Let the quiet hum of your modern world fade gently into the distance. You are about to drift softly into a time long past a time of stone keeps and muddy roads, of clanging bells and whispered prayers. But tonight's journey does not take us into the halls of kings or the battlefields of knights. Instead, we walk among the unnoticed, the forgotten, the orphans of medieval Europe. In this quiet telling, we will explore the often overlooked realities of children left without parents, in a world far less forgiving than our own. Their lives were shaped not by choice or ambition, but by circumstance, by plague, by famine, by war, and sometimes simply by the quiet passing of time. Let your mind wander back, centuries into the past. Imagine the feel of damp straw underfoot, the scent of soot clinging to rough woolen garments, the low murmur of distant voices in a language at once strange and familiar. The world of the medieval orphan awaits. Let us begin with the smallest details of their everyday life. Imagine waking in a narrow cot, if you were lucky enough to have one. The mattress beneath you is no more than a thin sack of straw, often damp and clinging with a musty scent. Your blanket is coarse, shared, or perhaps entirely absent. This is your morning as an orphan in the 13th century. Daily life for orphan children in medieval Europe was neither static nor uniform. It varied depending on place, period, and station. But most orphans, particularly those born to peasants, shared a common thread: the struggle to survive in a society where family was the cornerstone of existence, and to be without one meant not only sorrow, but danger. The term orphan in this era could mean different things. Some children had lost both parents, others only one. The death of a father, often the sole provider, could thrust a child and their surviving parent into destitution. The death of a mother might leave infants abandoned or cared for by overburdened relatives, if they existed. For those with no remaining kin, life was a slow trial of endurance. Many ended up in the rudimentary care of the church. Monasteries, convents, and ecclesiastical institutions maintained a sporadic, if earnest, concern for the welfare of orphans. But resources were limited. The kindness extended often depended on the availability of alms or on the usefulness of a child's labour. Meals were sparse and seldom resembled what we now consider nourishment. A coarse bread known as maslin, made from a mixture of rye and barley, was a staple. Gruel thin, salty, and lukewarm often served as the morning and evening meal. Occasionally, a scrap of cheese or a piece of boiled root might be added. Meat was rare, a luxury seen perhaps only on holy feast days. Work began early, sometimes as soon as a child could stand and carry a small bundle. In cities, orphan children might be pressed into apprenticeships, technically a form of training, but often little more than legal servitude. They swept floors, stirred vats, fetched water, and cleaned chamber pots. In rural communities, orphans joined harvests, tended animals, and were expected to keep pace with adults. Clothing, if provided, was generally cast-off patched, threadbare, and stiff with wear. Shoes were optional. Many went barefoot in summer and winter alike, feet toughened by frost and filth. There were no toys, as you might imagine them, though imagination still lived in small corners. Children played with carved sticks or woven dolls made of straw. They invented games with stones, sang songs whose origins are now long forgotten, and huddled together in the cold, whispering stories passed from one to another. Sleep, when it came, was often communal, children lying beside one another for warmth, lulled by the soft snoring of others, or the faint toll of the vesper bell. Safety was a distant idea. There were no locks, few walls, and even fewer guardians. A child who woke in the middle of the night might hear the patter of rats, the creak of the beams, or the wind pressing against shutters that no longer latched. Yet somehow, amidst this austerity, life continued. The human instinct to endure, to adapt, even in the face of indifference, played out every morning anew. Some children found odd jobs. Others formed makeshift families. A few were taken in by wealthier households, though such stories were the exception, and often came with their own forms of servitude. The streets of a medieval town were teeming with life, and among the crowd, orphans blended into the background shadows among the cobblestones. Their presence was known, if rarely acknowledged. Beggars, errand runners, sweeps, and sometimes nothing more than a small figure watching quietly from an alley's edge. This was their daily life, not glamorous, not heroic, but profoundly human. And now, we move from their quiet routines to the lives of a few who, though born into abandonment, still managed to leave a trace in the pages of history. As we drift gently onward, we turn now from the daily rhythms of medieval orphans to the rare moments when their lives emerged from the shadows and entered into the written record, fleeting mentions in court documents, chronicles, or religious accounts. Most names have been lost to time, yet a few linger, like faint impressions in soft earth. One such child was known simply as Johanna Filia Nullius, Johanna, daughter of no one. Her name appears in a London court roll dated to the early 14th century. She was no more than 12, caught stealing a crust of bread from a market stall. The record, brief and impersonal, notes her punishment, confinement, and return to the church that had charge of her. Her fate is unknown. What remains is the quiet resonance of that phrase, daughter of no one. In medieval society, lineage was identity. Names carried heritage, property, and protection. To be born of no one was to exist in a kind of legal and social purgatory. Orphans without sponsors or kin became municipal responsibilities if they were acknowledged at all. Some towns appointed special officers, such as wardens or beadles, to oversee the welfare of these children. But in reality, protection was often thin, and justice arbitrary. In contrast, there were exceptional stories too. Consider Edric of Norwich, a name recorded in the registry of St. Benedict's Monastery. He was taken in as an infant, after being left at the monastery gate, swaddled in rough linens, and tucked inside a basket. Raised among the Benedictine monks, Edric grew into literacy and discipline. By age 15, he had taken minor vows and assisted in copying manuscripts. His name appears on the colophon of a psalter, written by Edric, once without father or mother, now servant of God. Such stories remind us of the fragile but real possibility of transformation, even in an age where class and bloodlines defined so much. Events like the Black Death in the mid-14th century left tens of thousands of children orphaned. The plague, sweeping through towns and countryside alike, claimed entire households. In Florence, it was said that there were none left to bury the dead. Amid such devastation, local authorities struggled to house and feed abandoned children. Some were taken into new institutions, hastily founded for the purpose. Others roamed the streets in silent clusters, eking out survival from what they could find or take. In Paris, the Hôtel Dieu became a temporary refuge for many such children. Its ledgers mention them briefly, often listed without surnames. Martin, boy of 6 summers, no parents, given bread and a blanket, returned to the city watch for assignment. One remarkable and curious event occurred in 1185, in the town of Wexford, Ireland. A group of 10 children, all orphaned by a sudden coastal raid, were brought to the local church by a travelling monk named Aelfwine. His chronicle, now preserved only in fragments, records his reflections. They did not cry. They only stared, as if waiting for someone who would not return. I named them all after saints, for they had no names to give. These rare instances, fragile as parchment and sparse as winter crops, offer glimpses into lives that otherwise would have vanished entirely. The silence surrounding most medieval orphans is not an absence of story, but rather a sign of a world that did not believe their stories needed telling. And yet, we can still hear the faint echoes, if we listen closely. Now, we turn our attention to a quieter layer of the past, the material traces left behind, broken toys, small shoes, and the remains of forgotten shelters. In these fragments, archaeology gives form to memory. Let us now descend deeper, not into archives or manuscripts, but into the very soil of history. The lives of medieval orphans were rarely written down, but the earth sometimes remembers what parchment forgot. Through the work of archaeologists and historians, faint traces of these children emerge again. A carved spindle whorl here, a pair of worn leather shoes there, the foundation of a crumbled dormitory tucked beneath a modern street. Across England, excavations near medieval monasteries and leper hospitals have revealed small rooms and courtyards believed to have been used by child wards of the church. These are not grand spaces. Floors are uneven, walls often rebuilt over centuries, but remnants whisper their tales. Bits of charcoal where small fires were lit, bone fragments from modest meals, and scattered objects that suggest a child's hand once grasped them. In the ruins of St. Mary's Spital in London, a large hospital that once served the poor and sick, archaeologists discovered a series of shallow graves. Among them, skeletons of children aged from a few months to around 10 years. Some bore signs of malnutrition, others of healed injuries. Their placement, in a separate part of the graveyard, suggests they may have been wards of the hospital, perhaps orphans, abandoned or left behind by catastrophe. Among the most poignant finds was a tiny pewter cross, clutched in the hand of a child no older than 4. Its smooth edges and faded design suggest it had been worn and touched often, perhaps a source of comfort, a token given by a nun, or a relic of a parent now gone. It was buried with care. In northern France, similar discoveries were made near former beguinages, lay religious communities of women who sometimes took in unwanted or orphaned children. Excavations unearthed weaving tools made from bone, sized for small hands. It appears these orphans were taught to spin and weave essential skills, and perhaps the only path to survival or shelter. Even the simplest finds tell us something. In York, in a layer of medieval waste soil, a child's leather shoe was uncovered. Its sole, patch-repaired twice, was small, just a few inches long, and stitched inside was a scrap of parchment, illegible but present. Why it was placed there remains a mystery. Was it protection? A charm? Or perhaps just the only paper at hand, used for padding? Such mysteries abound. Traces of graffiti scratched into stone, childish scrawls, stick figures, symbols. Were they made in boredom, in secret rebellion, or simply to pass time? We'll never know. But their presence reaffirms a truth we sometimes forget, that even the least remembered children of history left behind marks of life. Some finds raise more questions than they answer. In the Netherlands, a cellar was uncovered beneath a former almshouse. Within it, scattered toys, a wooden horse, a ceramic whistle, a fabric ball long since decomposed. But there were no records of the space ever serving children. Why were they there? Did a caregiver shelter them unofficially? Were they the belongings of orphans who were never acknowledged? These physical remnants, humble and incomplete, piece together a mosaic of childhoods lived under hard circumstances. They do not romanticize. They do not excuse. They simply testify quietly, patiently to the fact that children lived and mattered, even when the world did not write their names. As we rise gently from the soil and dust ourselves off, we move now into the layers of society above to explore how orphans were perceived, managed, and remembered, if at all, by the broader world around them. As we leave behind the buried remains of forgotten childhoods, we emerge into the visible world of medieval society, a realm shaped by rank, duty, and perception. Here, orphaned children occupied a peculiar and often uncomfortable space. Neither truly inside nor wholly outside, they hovered at the edges of awareness, largely unseen by the elites, whose lives revolved around lineage, bloodlines, and legacy. In the medieval worldview, family was not merely emotional, it was legal, economic, and sacred. Lineage determined one's role, worth, and destiny. The nobility maintained careful records of birth and descent, with great effort placed on the continuity of estates and titles. In this scheme, orphans, especially those of peasant or unknown origin, were anomalies, difficult to place and easy to overlook. Yet they were not entirely absent from elite consciousness. When noble children were orphaned, the difference was stark. The church or the crown often intervened to assign guardianship and manage inherited lands. Legal records from England's chancery courts are filled with entries about the fates of noble wards' lands held in trust, guardians appointed, marriage arrangements negotiated. These children, though orphaned, were still valuable. A child such as Eleanor de Montfort, orphaned during the baronial wars of the 13th century, became a political chess piece. Placed in a convent for protection, her guardianship passed from hand to hand with each shift in power. She was never truly abandoned, rather. She was preserved as an asset, her future mapped out long before she could shape it herself. But for those without titles or holdings, the narrative was quite different. Among townsfolk and the rural poor, orphans were more a social concern than a familial one. Local lords occasionally provided alms or permitted the church to use a corner of land for sheltering children. Some guilds, associations of craftsmen and merchants maintained rudimentary systems for supporting orphans of their members, providing food, training, or housing. Yet even this depended heavily on the goodwill of individuals. In rare cases, the elite took public action. A noteworthy example comes from 14th century Florence, where the wealthy merchant Francesco d'Attini, himself once an orphan, established a charitable foundation for foundlings. His ledgers detailed and businesslike record the provisioning of small amounts of flour, milk, and cloth to orphan homes. He did not act out of sentiment, but rather a mix of civic duty, religious conviction, and perhaps a distant memory of vulnerability. In royal courts, orphans might appear symbolically, as objects of charity. Some were taken in to serve as pages or scullions. A few lucky ones might rise through service, their loyalty and lack of family ties seen as advantageous. But these were outliers, exceptional stories that did not reflect the norm. More often, elite society preferred its orphans quiet, out of sight, confined to church-run institutions or left to parish officials. They were recipients of scraps of leftover wool, of unclaimed bread, of the clothing of the dead. They were tolerated, not embraced. Even in death, the division remained. While noble orphans might be buried with markers, or even within church walls, the majority were interred in communal plots, anonymous, unadorned, and quickly forgotten. And yet, there was another layer to their existence in society, the stories told about them, tales of miraculous orphans, saintly children abandoned and found by angels, or infants raised by hermits circulated through sermons and songs. These stories were not about real orphans, but rather about the anxieties and hopes of the communities that imagined them. They provided comfort, perhaps, or instruction, but they did not change the daily lives of the truly abandoned. So we see a world in which orphan children were at once visible and invisible, recognized when convenient, ignored when not. Their worth measured not by need or innocence, but by what, if anything, they could contribute to the social order. Let us now gently shift our gaze to the institutions that grew around these children. Not homes, exactly, but places of refuge, rules, and routine. The orphanages and church houses that formed the brittle backbone of care. From the grand halls of nobility to the quiet corners of society, our path now leads us to the places specifically built or adapted to harbour those without family. In an age before the welfare state, before social workers and case numbers, care for orphans was a fragmented network of intentions, most often anchored in religious duty, local charity, or vague civic obligation. The medieval orphanage, as we understand it today, did not truly exist until the later Middle Ages. Before that, orphaned children were typically taken in by monastic communities, cathedral chapters, or almshouses, institutions originally designed for the elderly, sick, or poor, but sometimes expanded to include foundlings and abandoned youth. Many such institutions were tied to the church. Religious houses, particularly those of Benedictines and Augustinians, often maintained guest halls, where the truly destitute might find temporary shelter. Orphans who entered these spaces did so quietly, without fanfare. They were fed, clothed, and in some cases, educated. But resources were finite, and priorities varied. In France, the Maison Dieu, House of God, movement began to incorporate specific wings for children. Records from a hospital in Beaune indicate that by the 13th century, separate dormitories were created for boys and girls under 12. The boys were trained in manual labour kitchen work, cleaning, field duties. The girls were often taught spinning, lace-making, and other textile arts. Formal education was rare. Reading was reserved for those few expected to enter monastic life. In Italy, the need for organised care grew alongside the population. One of the earliest true orphanages was the Ospedale degli Innocenti in Florence, established in 1445. Designed by the architect Filippo Brunelleschi, it still stands today, a testament to both architectural grace and social necessity. Babies were left anonymously through a rotating stone wheel called a ruota, allowing desperate mothers to relinquish infants without being seen. From there, wet nurses and caregivers took over, though many children still died in infancy. The Innocenti was among the first to implement detailed records. Each child was given a name, often reflecting the circumstances of their arrival. Domenico, for a child left on Sunday. Stella, for one left under the stars. These names were both identifiers and quiet memorials to the unknown past. Elsewhere, In northern Europe, Beguine communities lay sisterhoods of pious women sometimes accepted orphans into their fold. Without formal vows, these women created homes that were both spiritual and domestic, offering orphans a life of prayer, craft, and mutual care. They were neither convents nor schools, but something tenderly in between. But not all institutions were so gentle. In some cities, orphan children were grouped into workhouses, early predecessors of the industrial orphanage. There, the emphasis was less on nurture and more on productivity. Children sorted wool, cleaned flax, or helped in tanneries. Their meals were minimal, their days long, their oversight stern. Corporal punishment was accepted, and affection optional. The church's role was central but complicated. While many clergy were genuinely devoted to care, others saw orphans as burdens. Their presence tolerated more out of duty than compassion. Papal bulls and diocesan decrees occasionally addressed their treatment, but enforcement varied greatly. Over time, some guilds and fraternities began to sponsor charitable homes for children of their own trades: shoemakers' wards, blacksmiths' apprentices, stonemasons' boys. These offered a structured path, shelter, discipline, and eventual employment. Yet entrance often required proof of parentage, baptism, or good character, qualities not all orphans could produce. And so, the care institutions of the medieval world were as diverse and uneven as the society they served. Some were havens, others were holding pens. Most existed somewhere in between places of routine, rules, and quiet hopes, where a child might, if fortunate, find a path forward. Let us now move from brick and parchment to something more ephemeral: the whispers, fears, and beliefs that surrounded these children. Superstition and myth often coloured their place in the medieval imagination, sometimes offering comfort, and other times, suspicion. In the flickering candlelight of medieval evenings, when shadows stretched long across stone floors, and the scent of tallow mingled with wood smoke, people told stories. Stories of saints and sinners, miracles and monsters, and sometimes of orphans. Alone and untethered from family, these children often stirred the imagination in ways both tender and troubling. To be an orphan in medieval society was not only a material condition, it was also a spiritual one. Without parents to vouch for their soul, to guide them through confession, or ensure they were properly baptized and blessed, the orphan was sometimes viewed with a subtle unease. Vulnerable, yes, but also liminal, not fully rooted in the earthly or social order. In folk belief, orphans were occasionally seen as spiritually susceptible, more likely to be visited by angels, or, more darkly, by devils. The idea that their souls might be especially appealing to the forces of both good and evil shaped the way they were spoken of in sermons and legends. Priests sometimes warned that children left unguarded by parental love might stray into temptation. Others believed that a particularly pious orphan might be marked for sainthood. Indeed, several early Christian saints, such as Saint Agnes of Rome and Saint Nicholas, were said to have lost their parents young and to have turned their solitude into sanctity. These tales inspired both comfort and expectation, though the average orphan rarely lived up to the glow of such legends. Superstitions took root in the gaps where understanding failed. In isolated villages, orphaned children were sometimes blamed quietly, and without evidence for crop failure, illness, or misfortune. Their presence was unfamiliar, their ties uncertain. A child who arrived after a bad harvest might be seen as a harbinger, not through malice, but through a deep medieval need to explain suffering. And yet, countercurrents of protection also ran deep. Certain customs developed to ward off the spiritual risks associated with orphanhood. In parts of Ireland and Wales, villagers would place small charms, bits of iron, sprigs of yarrow, or even pebbles marked with crosses near the beds of orphaned children. These tokens were meant to ward off night fears, or protect against the wandering souls of the dead who, it was feared, might try to claim an untended child. One recurring motif in folk tales is the blessed orphan, a child who shows kindness to strangers and is rewarded with sudden fortune or favour. These stories, while fictional, may have offered a form of social instruction. Treat even the lowest among you with care, for they may be watched over by higher powers. Interestingly, the trope of the changeling, a fairy child left in place of a stolen human infant, was occasionally applied to orphans found under strange or unexplained circumstances. A child discovered at the edge of the woods, or one who survived an illness that killed others. might be regarded with cautious awe. Whispers of fey blood or divine purpose followed them, sometimes granting unusual status, other times inviting suspicion. Monasteries, too, had their share of beliefs. It was not uncommon for monks to mark the baptismal records of foundlings with small crosses or marginal symbols. Whether meant as protection or warning, the exact meanings are now lost, but they remind us that even within the structured world of the church, superstition quietly thrived. These beliefs coexisted with everyday indifference or bureaucratic routine. A child might be at once ignored and symbolically powerful, and through it all, the orphan themselves had little say in the roles assigned to them: sacred, cursed, or invisible. Now, let us shift again. Having explored the seen and unseen layers of orphanhood, we turn to the small acts of resilience, the quiet networks of survival, friendship, and solidarity among the children themselves. In the absence of parents, some made families of their own. In the absence of blood ties and legal kinship, orphan children of the Middle Ages often forged their own webs of connection, quiet, instinctive networks formed not by name or birthright, but by proximity, shared hardship, and the gentle necessity of survival. These informal communities varied in shape and substance. In the rural countryside, orphans left to wander might band together, moving from village to village, taking odd jobs or begging at market gates. In towns and cities, where abandoned children were more numerous, small groups often gathered in alleys, behind taverns, or near monastery kitchens, where leftovers were sometimes passed over low walls. They were not gangs in the modern sense, not violent collectives or organized crime groups, but rather shifting assemblies of mutual reliance. A slightly older child might help a younger one find a dry place to sleep. A boy with access to scraps of bread might share them in exchange for warmth or company. These alliances were fragile, born of trust and necessity, but they could last months, even years. In Paris, a chronicler in the 14th century noted a group of children known as les petits frères de la nuit, the little brothers of the night. These orphans were said to appear together in the dim hours before dawn, sweeping courtyards and collecting refuse, sometimes singing low songs as they worked. Whether this was fact or folklore is unclear, but the image endures. Children not bound by name, but by nighttime labor and quiet fraternity. In larger institutions, too, children forged connections. Within orphan houses, dormitories, and church-run schools, friendships bloomed under candlelight and shared chores. Older children often acted as informal guardians to younger ones, showing them where to hide when punishment loomed, teaching them the quiet rhythms of the house, or slipping them bits of bread when rations fell short. Some surrogate families even formed. It was not uncommon for two children, especially those who entered institutions together, to refer to one another as brother or sister, regardless of blood. In some rare cases, such chosen bonds were acknowledged in adulthood, appearing in wills or guild records, where one orphan named another as heir, guardian, or witness. Among girls, the ties could be especially poignant. In weaving rooms or laundries, days were long and repetitive, and the shared experience of labor, neglect, and growing up too fast forged a quiet solidarity. They mended one another's clothes, soothed each other through illness, whispered songs after curfew, and, when possible, ran away together. Not all groups were benign. Some older children learned to survive through thievery or deception, recruiting younger ones into their efforts. Urban authorities occasionally noted bands of orphans, who scavenged, stole, or pestered passers-by. Yet even here, there is a sense of structure of rules enforced by those within, a crude echo of family authority. In the records of a 15th century English town, a curious entry describes two boys, aged 9 and 12, who appeared regularly at church but lived nowhere officially. When questioned, they said they were brothers by bread, a phrase that lingered in the margins of the court roll. No one knew where they came from. No one ever found their parents. But they came back, week after week, sitting beside one another in the far pew. These fragile bonds, formed in the gaps left by society, were lifelines. In a world of limited charity and cold efficiency, it was often the warmth of another orphan's presence that provided the greatest protection. Now, as we near the end of our journey, we turn toward the quieter hours of life, not the daily toil or shared companionship, but the moments of rest, reflection, and the small rituals that gave meaning to lives so often overlooked. As the medieval day drew to a close, marked not by clocks, but by the slow tolling of vesper bells and the fading glow of the sky, even the most burdened lives sought moments of rest. For orphans, these intervals of calm were not free from hardship, but they carried a muted rhythm all their own, a kind of stillness shaped by repetition, necessity, and hope. Imagine now an orphan child in a small dormitory, nestled under the wooden eaves of a monastic hospital or an orphan house. The air is cool and close, thick with the scent of old rushes and the lingering tang of boiled broth from the evening meal. Around them, other children shuffle into makeshift beds, some on straw mats, others on wooden boards, perhaps a lucky few with coarse woolen blankets. The quiet of the evening was often the most contemplative time of day. During daylight, movement and task absorbed thought, hauling water, sweeping floors, carding wool. But at night, especially in institutions tied to the church, routine gave way to quiet rituals, a whispered prayer before sleep, a sign of the cross, taught by rote, even if the meaning felt distant. For many, it was less about piety than habit, a gesture of something familiar in a world without certainties. Some institutions followed strict religious hours. Children were expected to rise at lauds before sunrise and sleep after compline, the final service of the day. Candles were expensive, so darkness came early. In that darkness, small voices sometimes murmured, songs remembered from home, lullabies barely recalled, or rhymes passed from one child to another. There were few personal possessions, but what little was kept: a ribbon, a smooth stone, a wooden token might be cradled in the hand during sleep. These were not toys in the usual sense. They were anchors, symbols of memory, of continuity, of some small comfort. Illness was a constant presence in these places. In the cramped dormitories of orphan houses, coughs echoed in the night, and the shuffling of caregivers' sandals signaled visits to the sick. Death, though not spoken of often, was understood early. Children developed their own rituals for it, gestures of respect, shared silences, or even hiding in corners when loss felt too heavy to witness again. But there was beauty, too, in these quiet hours. In springtime, an orphan might listen to birds nesting in the eaves above. In winter, the creaking of beams and soft murmurs of nearby sleepers provided a strange comfort. Older children sometimes told stories, tales from remembered homes, or borrowed from the mouths of clerics and servants. These were not grand epics, but simple fables and parables. Stories of kindness repaid, of cleverness triumphing, of mercy found in unlikely places. Festive days broke the routine with rare delight. On certain saints' days or feast days, even the poorest institutions made effort, offering sweetened gruel, or bits of fruit, or candles to hold during evening prayers. Some children, particularly those raised within the church's walls, developed a strong connection to religious ritual. They learned to chant, to light incense, to kneel at the right time. For some, the chapel became the closest thing to a parent, a structure that never changed, a presence that never left. And always, there was sleep. Uneven, interrupted, sometimes cold. But still, sleep came. Beneath sagging beams and beneath distant stars, orphaned children closed their eyes each night, not knowing what tomorrow would hold, but still rising to meet it. Now, as we leave behind their stories, their work, their play, their rituals and resilience, we return quietly to our own time. Let us gently close this journey, not with sorrow, but with a calm remembrance of all that these forgotten children endured, and all that they made of the little they were given. And so, dear listener, we return softly from the world of stone cloisters and wind-worn streets, from the dim glow of candlelit dormitories and the echoing hush of cloistered hallways. The story of medieval orphans is not one of great deeds or crowned legacies. It is a story of the unnoticed, of resilience without reward, of survival without song. These children, left behind by fate and forgotten by history, lived quiet lives shaped by absence of parents, of security, of names, and yet, within that silence, they made meaning. They formed bonds. They worked. They endured. They learned to live within the rhythm of bells and bowls, of chores and chants. They found ways to care for one another, to play with scraps of cloth and carved wood, to whisper songs as night fell across stone walls. They forged new kinds of families, brothers by bread, sisters of the dormitory, children of the cloister and the street. Though few monuments were built for them, and fewer still remembered their names, the marks they left were real, in worn shoes buried beneath city soil, in half-faded records written by hurried monks, in the deep, layered silence of medieval towns where children once waited at gates, peered through hedges, or huddled together for warmth. And as you rest now, perhaps with the gentle hum of modern comforts all around you, a warm bed, a soft light, the faint murmur of electricity, let the contrast gently settle in your thoughts. That once, in the long shadows of another world, children slept with far less, yet still they dreamed, still they sang, still they woke each morning to another day. The past is never truly gone. It rests beneath our feet, folded into the earth and the stories we tell. Now, let your mind drift, gently, like smoke from a hearth into the night. The bells have rung, the streets are quiet, the children have gone to sleep. So may you. Good night.